Good afternoon. In recent decades, presidential power has expanded dramatically. The president has been testing the limits of the Constitution just this year by removing the heads of independent agencies without cause, blocking funds authorized and already appropriated by Congress, and by deploying military forces domestically. These actions are tied to an obscure, or at least once obscure, idea: the unitary executive theory. It was once a fringe concept. Now, the unitary executive theory is at the heart of some of the most urgent problems and debates about presidential power, about how presidential power, how far it can and should go. At this Brennan Center event, I'll be joined by participants who will help explore the unitary executive theory, where it comes from, why it's relevant today, and what its growing influence means for the future of US democracy. Good afternoon. Again, my name is Wilfred Codrington. I'm a law professor at Cardozo Law School, and I'll be your moderator today. You may know that Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute whose mission is to strengthen the systems that democracy and justice so that they work for all Americans. The Brennan Center cannot and will not support or oppose any candidate for office, but we can and we will today vigorously explore and debate the policies and positions that matter for our democracy. Remember that civility is important to all of us as we try to engage in a productive discussion. Therefore, those who post rude or intemperate language in our message streams, whether on YouTube or Facebook, will be removed from the conversation. Live closed captioning will be provided, and you can follow along with the conversation on social media using the hashtag Brennan Center Live. Now for today's program. Please join me in welcoming our panel of leading historians and legal experts on the matter of presidential power. Sam Breitbart is a counsel in the Brennan Center's Democracy Program. Jane Manners is an associate professor of law at Fordham Law School. Julian Davis Morrison is the James G. Phillip Professor of Law at the University of Michigan Law School. And Christina Rodriguez, the Deputy Dean and the Leighton Homer Surbeck Professor of Law at the Yale Law School. Thank you all for joining us today. And I just want to input a note for the audience. Please do remember to submit your questions via the chat. We're going to save some time to answer them with around 15 to 20 minutes left in the program. So, Julian, why don't you help kick things off? When we hear about President Trump and his administration, as well as the current Supreme Court, and how they think about presidential power, we often hear about this idea, the unitary executive theory. Can you take a stab at defining the unitary executive theory, telling us what it claims and claims it does and does not make about executive power?
Absolutely. Happy to do it. Happy to be here. Happy to be sharing panel space with such a terrific group of folks. I would start by dividing between two flavors or varieties of the claims that are meant when people talk about unitary executive claims. First, unitary executive claims that amount to something that could be thought of as the royal presidency, the monarchical presidency. And second, unitary executive claims that focus on control of administration and lack of ordinary administrative processes as part of how the government works. We take a second to divide the two out and talk about the stakes of each. The narrower version, narrower but still powerful, striking, and I think at odds with the country's constitutional history, is the idea that under the Constitution, it doesn't list many powers for the president, but one of the powers it does list in terms of the things that a president is authorized to do by the text of the Constitution itself is, quote, the executive power. And the claim goes that anytime a statute or law is passed at the federal government, What the executive power means for the president to possess is complete discretionary control about how, whether, when to implement that statute within the bounds of what the statute says. So the president has to be the one ultimately who can at any moment change how the federal government is executing laws, change who is executing the laws, change whether to execute the laws at all, fire anybody at any time if they're not doing what he wants, and replace any agency, any federal official's actions with the president's preferences. It renders, in its pure form, all of federal government decision-making a function of what the president wants without any room for ordinary administrative process. The other thing that people mean, and the two are not in tension. In some ways, the second version includes the true unitary executive, the true administrative control theory, is the idea of the royal presidency. Come back to the fact that the Constitution does not list many powers for the president. There just aren't many powers in there. People who assert, going back to probably most famously in many people's political memories, Dick Cheney in the first Bush administration, this sort of substantive royal monarchical unitary executive theory, go well beyond claims about how the president gets to make all kinds of final decisions about how to execute the statutes. The additional claim with the monarchical theory is that the president can do a wide range of things that a king or a monarch could do, even though the Constitution doesn't say so. So the president can use military force international or even domestically without authorization. The president can take all kinds of emergency measures without the involvement of Congress, removing people from the country, engaging in systematic surveillance, torture programs. President can tear up treaties without an approval or okay from Congress. President can even control spending. President can refuse to spend money or maybe even spend money that's not allowed. So the narrower version focuses on all of government as being an extension of the president's will so that he can replace anybody at any time with somebody he prefers. The broader version adds to that the idea that even if the president doesn't have the written authority to do things like I've mentioned with military force, emergency measures, and so forth, the fact that he's a president, period, alone, enables him, they claim, to take that action even if every other entity in the federal government disagrees, disapproves, or uses its own authority to stop what they're doing.
Thank you for that comprehensive answer, Julian. Christina, I want to ask you a question. I want to know more about the origins of the unitary executive theory. Can you talk about who maybe advanced this first, and more importantly, how it's evolved to where it is today over time?
I'll start where Julian started, with what I think of as the actual unitary executive theory when lawyers and legal scholars use that term. And that is the idea that because all power is vested in the president has control over the executive branch. That theory and its related claims that the president could fire officers of the United States at will was originally developed during the Nixon, Ford, and Reagan administrations, when Republican presidents faced liberal Congresses and a bureaucracy and a civil service that was the product of the New Deal civil rights eras. And the rise of the legal theory of the president having control over the executive branch, including the authority to fire anyone he wished, or at least officers of the United States, was intertwined in its rise with the goals of the conservative legal movement and, frankly, the Republican Party. And that was skepticism of administration and regulation. Unitary theory sits alongside a belief in the need to rein in the bureaucracy. And the point was to enable presidents to get control of the bureaucracy and to resist congressional interference with the president's exercise of powers. Of course, Democratic presidents could also use this theory to serve their ends, so it could serve liberal or progressive causes. But for late 20th century conservatives, the real opponent was government bureaucracies and the growing activist state, because over time, bureaucracies tend to increase regulation. And so the idea of the unitary executive served those goals. The Reagan Justice Department and lawyers within it in particular really developed the legal basis of this theory. Two lawyers who served in that Justice Department were John Roberts and Justice Sam Alito, who are currently on the Supreme Court, may have something to say about this as justices. They grounded the legal theory of the unitary executive in the grant in Article 2, Section 1, that the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States, as Julian began by mentioning. And there were opinions, the canonical dissent by Justice Scalia and Morrison versus Olson, the case that upholds the Independent Counsel Act, that decries efforts by Congress to limit the president's capacity to fire executive officials as undermining accountability and therefore liberty. I'll say a quick word too about the second version that Julian mentions, because it has a less clearly elaborated legal basis and is less apparent in judicial precedent, but clearly present in the rise of what today we're calling the Imperial Presidency. The idea that the president has exclusive, preclusive, or inherent powers that Congress cannot abrogate, is rooted in longstanding constitutional thought, even in the Youngstown decision and Justice Jackson's famous opinion, where he describes the distribution of powers between Congress and the president. He does allude to the idea that there are certain conclusive and preclusive powers that cannot be controlled. We might describe these as the vestige of monarchical power. The commander-in-chief power that's in Article 2 is often given as an example of a source of this authority. And the idea is that there are certain decisions the president makes as commander-in-chief that cannot be second-guessed by Congress or the courts. For example, making tactical decisions on the battlefield. The second Bush administration really develops this idea by claiming that it had inherent powers to detain enemy combatants, to establish military tribunals, to try those enemy combatants, and most notoriously to interrogate in a manner that amounted to torture or cruel and inhuman degrading treatment, regardless of what Congress might say in trying to prohibit that treatment. That version of the idea that the president has powers that can't be controlled by Congress was largely rejected by the Supreme Court in that era. And it was also abandoned by a later iteration of the second Bush administration, but it has not gone away. In fact, it's come back in many of President Trump's executive orders. He has claimed inherent authority, as Julian suggested, to deport people from the United States, to exclude people from the United States, to do away with all of the immigration laws that govern the border in order to protect the sovereignty of the states of the nation and of the nation itself. And so the idea that there are prerogatives that the president has is something that has been argued to defend presidential actions that push the limits of the law across administrations, and is still very much in use today.
History is complicated. I'd love for you to delve into some of the historical arguments that the unitary executive theory advocates are making in their position. Maybe explain whether they actually support the theory itself.
Yeah, so I'm going to follow Julian and Christina's lead and kind of talk about the kind of larger maximalist vision of the presidency as a kind of monarchical model, and then also the kind of narrower question, the unitary executive question of whether the president has kind of plenary power over what we often refer to as the administrative state, the entire executive branch. So, and the irony is that most proponents of these visions of presidential power consider themselves originalists, meaning that they are bound by the original meaning of the Constitution. But the historical evidence shows that, in fact, the framers and legal thinkers in the founding era did not have a maximalist vision of presidential power. We know the founding generation was very wary of monarchical power. They knew that every prior republic had failed because of executive overreach. So the historical record is full of statements like that of Thomas Paine, who says that in America, the law is king because in free countries, the law must be king, as opposed to in absolute countries where the king is the law. We have statements like that from future Supreme Court Justice James Iredell, who assured the North Carolina ratifying convention that if the president commits any crime, he is punishable by the laws of his country. And in some ways, you see this kind of the fact of this paucity of historical evidence kind of shaping Supreme Court's recent jurisprudence. So, for instance, Trump versus United States, which is the decision that granted presidential immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts, that opinion was actually notably light on historical evidence and instead kind of leaned into a constitutional tradition of separation of powers. On the narrower question of the kind of president's power to remove officers, the evidence is similarly thin. So there is no removal power in the Constitution. There was no mention of a removal power during the Constitutional Convention or the ratification debates. That's something we would expect to see raised by the anti-federalists because they were very alert to concentrated executive power, but there's just no mention. Some unitary executive theorists point to the British backdrop, but we in fact know that Parliament limited the king's power to appoint and remove officers in all sorts of ways. Non-removable offices were common, as were offices for life conditioned on good behavior. Some historians have also pointed to founding era state practice, saying we can see evidence there of executive removal power, but in fact, we see little to no evidence that founding era legal thinkers thought removal was an inherent executive power, something that the legislature couldn't take away. Sometimes, because of this kind of paucity of evidence of within the kind of constitutional framework itself, you see cases in which folks arguing for a unitary executive history or historical evidence point to something called the Decision of 1789, which was an instance in which the first Congress is alleged to have recognized an inherent presidential power to remove officers who had been jointly appointed by the president and the Senate. This was a debate over the Foreign Affairs Secretary. It's a debate that Chief Justice Taft, who himself is a former president, made much of in his 1926 decision opinion, Myers versus United States, which held that Congress could not prevent the president from removing a principal officer at will. But in fact, recent scholarship has shown that the 1789 debate did not show that most members of the first Congress believed that the president had an inherent removal authority. And if anything, it shows kind of widespread resistance to that idea. I think the best way to conceptualize how members of the framing generation thought about officer tenure was that it was something the legislature got to shape. The legislature wanted to create the right mix of carrots and sticks to incentivize appropriate behavior given the nature of the office. So sometimes they made the office unremovable for a term of years. Sometimes they made the office a life tenure, removable only for bad behavior. Sometimes they made the office removable at pleasure. And they did this because they wanted to kind of create the right structure for optimal behavior. So James Madison writes in Federalist 39 that the tenure of ministerial offices generally will be a subject of legal regulation, meaning legislative determination, conformable to the reason of the case and the example of the state constitutions. And that is what he has in mind, that determining the tenure of an office is a legislative responsibility.
Thanks, Jane. I want to come back to you later for some more history on it. That's fascinating. But Sam, maybe I can ask you a question about today. How do you see the current administration employing this theory? What are they doing in the Trump administration to mobilize it?
Yeah, thanks, Wilfred. So the Trump administration is repeatedly claiming an inherent authority to ignore the normal checks on the presidency. And if we're going back to Julian's taxonomy, they're leaning toward a monarchical version of the presidency, literally claiming, much like a royal prerogative, that the president is above the law, or at least above the laws that Congress passes and that the president doesn't like. One way to think about what's going on here is that the president is not just aggregating power for himself, but is actually taking power away from Congress, taking the lawmaking power for himself, usurping the legislative power. So how are we seeing this play out? A number of different ways. So to begin with, there are those areas where the Trump administration is claiming that the president can straight up defy Congress, right? So we've seen this, as Jane was just alluding to, in the places where the Trump administration has fired agency officials, despite the fact that Congress has given very clear standards for when and whether they can do so. But the Trump administration has ignored those standards. And when asked why, it claims for itself a complete power to fire the officials whenever it wants. We've seen a similar claim of a power to defy Congress in the context of the across-the-board funding freeze, which the administration attempted to enact upon taking office. So, we know that Congress has the spending power and the power to make appropriations laws, but the Trump administration is claiming that it can ignore those appropriations laws to the extent they conflict with the policy priorities of the president. We've seen a claim of a power to effectively ignore laws which establish and empower certain government offices and departments and agencies. So it's on that very basis that the Trump administration has asserted an authority to reduce the size of the Department of Education. It's made no secret of its desire to abolish DOE, or even to dismantle agencies like, say, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. We've even seen assertions of power to ignore the law in areas like the TikTok ban, where it's almost like the Trump administration is just pretending the law doesn't exist. They're declining to enforce the law, and when asked about it, are claiming some vague constitutional authority to do so because the law might implicate the nation's foreign affairs. So if you think about all these things together, what I like to think of is that the president is almost claiming some kind of second veto power, a veto power that exists nowhere in the Constitution, but that would allow the president to rewrite laws that he does not like. And so that's where the president is straight up ignoring Congress, you might say. Now, of course, it's the case that there are those areas where the president and the Trump administration more generally is wrapping itself in statutes that Congress has passed in order to justify some of the actions that it takes. But even then, it's often claimed authority beyond any fair reading of those statutes. And of course, that's a major problem, too. So we've seen this where the Trump administration has claimed powers to initiate tariffs or deploy the military domestically. What we have here is a combination of an expansive reading of the statutes that Congress has passed, plus this belief that we keep alluding to that the president has some inherent power to pursue policies by essentially any means. And altogether, that has meant that the Trump administration is once again willingly sidelining Congress. And then finally, what we've seen is, I think, a replication of what happened in the first Trump administration, which is the Trump administration's continued violation of norms and conventions that have typically bound the president. So this includes the use and abuse of executive orders to target individuals and law firms and universities, the politicization of law enforcement more generally. Those are just classic violations of norms, and we've seen a continuation from the Trump 1 term to now. I think it's worth mentioning at this point, and it sort of goes back to the point that Julian and Christina and Jane have all made, that some unitary executive scholars, they might balk at the total expansion of the presidency that President Trump is pursuing. They might say that this goes well beyond what they contemplated. But what I would argue is that almost everything President Trump is doing as he leans towards this monarchical version of the presidency runs downstream from the unitary executive theory as originally articulated, in the 80s and the 90s, even if it was meant to be a more narrow version about controlling the administrative state. Because the idea that the president has some inherent authority to defy Congress or to act in unchecked ways simply makes it much more likely that a president like Trump would come along and abuse his power and push any remaining boundaries. And finally, I would note that as President Trump is doing this, there's been tacit and often very explicit acquiescence on the part of the other branches of government, so both Congress and the Supreme Court. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on.
Thanks, Sam. And if I could follow up, you mentioned some invisible veto power, and specifically mentioning some of the issues related to the budget. Is there a case from the Supreme Court about the line item veto, and what does that have to do with this? Or what might it tell us about this?
I'm happy to defer to others on that who might, be very familiar with that case. But I think it's an important piece of the puzzle. There is a case from the 1980s. I'm thinking of the legislative veto. There's also cases on the line item veto that others might be equipped to talk about. But I guess the idea here is, generally speaking, the Supreme Court has gone a long way towards limiting what other branches of government might be able to do to hem in the president, or conversely, as with the line item veto, to give the president more authority when there is questions of funding. I'm not sure if others have, including the law professors on here, would be interested in talking about that case.
Hey, Julie, maybe you could jump in and add to that what you will, but also maybe also talk about more generally how the Supreme Court has helped to lay these foundations for the unitary executive theory.
Sure. I mean, there's lots of stuff to say about the Supreme Court's role in facilitating and encouraging the emergence of this substantive, imperial, royal, monarchical, prerogative version of executive power that we've all been talking about, with its cases largely in the tradition of looking at how custom and tradition and interactions between the political branches over time ought to inform the Constitution. The short version of the problem with what the courts have done or have let stay open as an argument to be made and not shut down, and in fact have encouraged in the various cases involving the first Trump administration, is that the court finds itself in the cases where these things are contested, looks to dismiss every deferential action by the president as a political choice by the president, and seeks to maximize every failure to act by Congress in response to some presidential action as expressing acquiescence or expressing agreement with what the president has done. And when you combine that with an internal executive apparatus that has lots of institutional memory, that has lots of prestige, the Office of Legal Counsel, at least one of our panelists today did work with the Office of Legal Counsel, that creates a very one-sided voice for trying to assess what custom and tradition looks like. And it's just analytically at odds with how custom and tradition analysis has worked over most of the course of Anglo-American legal history. I'd also say on the unitary executive proper front, this idea that the president controls the entire executive branch. The president is the executive branch. This dissent that I think Christina mentioned from Justice Scalia, sole dissent from Justice Scalia in the Morrison case, badly wrong in lots of really important historical ways. I would go so far as to say embarrassingly wrong about some key historical facts, nonetheless gets treated for years by unitary executive advocates as sort of this the secret truth that nobody on the Supreme Court in the majority dared to speak. And it was normalized, essentialized, the theory that to possess the executive power means you get to control everything, was treated as, of course, obviously the real theory of the Constitution. Everything else was kind of squishy, going along with violations of the Constitution for practicality's sake. And what you've seen, I think, certainly in the lower courts, but also at the Supreme Court with the rise of the Roberts Court, is the problem that the Roberts Court has pivoted, really undone enormous amounts of doctrine about the degree to which the legislative process, as Jane said, is supposed to be the process that tells us how the government works, and has pivoted from that into, at least in principle, a very pure version, the way it describes the principles of the unitary executive theory, a very pure version that equates in a really simplistic's not always bad, but in a very simplistic way, possession of the executive power with ability to remove anybody, anywhere, direct actions, anybody, anywhere, with some exceptions that over and over again are expressed in exactly the kind of mushy, not sort of philosophically bounded categories that for years and years and years, unitary executive theorists successfully argued was why Justice Scalia's Morrison dissent was right. So if you take the theory, the raw basic theory of the executive power translating into total control over government personnel at the removal end of things and total control over decision-making by those officials, it's really, really hard, and I would say essentially impossible as a matter of constitutional theory to explain why there should be exceptions for administrative law judges, why there should be exceptions for the civil service, why there should be a Fed exception. The only way you get to acknowledging, in my view, that the civil service is valid, that administrative law judges in their current form are valid, the Federal Bank Reserve's independence is valid, is by conceding the point that Jane emphasized from the beginning, which is the whole theory of how our Constitution approached government from the beginning was in the spirit of the legislature being the branch over time to develop, revise, and evolve how we think about running the government, and trying to run a 21st century government, let alone an 18th century government, through some sort of pure notion of what the executive power means, is unsustainable. And I think we may be seeing a sort of dog that caught the bus phenomenon with the Supreme Court in its majority, still trying to suggest that these exceptions for the civil service, et cetera, exist.
I also want to note the irony when you talk about Olson. Justice Kagan has talked about loving reading that decision, and yet she is diametrically opposed to that view. If you read any of her cases that she's written, her dissents mostly, and her scholarship. But I want to talk to the scholar that Julian mentioned who did serve in OLC, and that's Christina. Christina, you've written a lot about the unitary executive lately, including how it just really doesn't make sense practically for the executive branch to work like that. Could you kind of talk a little bit about that, why it doesn't?
So the idea of presidential control over the entirety of what the executive branch does is a practical impossibility. The executive branch is vast. It's made up of approximately 4,000 political appointees named by the extant administration. And they are among 2 million civil servants and 1.5 million military personnel. So officials across agencies make intricate decisions every day that cannot be controlled by the White House. Historically, the White House does take special interest in certain policy initiatives. The Obama White House was very involved in the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. The White House often kicks the tires, so to speak, on policies that are bubbling up from the agencies. But presidential priorities, generally and historically, diffuse through political appointees to help shape the agendas of agencies. But there are also statutory mandates and bureaucratic cultures that define the work of the executive branch. And the argument that I've made with my co-author, Anya Bernstein, is that the president cannot and should not overcome those. Another way of putting it is that the core theoretical claim of the unitary executive, that the ability to fire political appointees enables the president to control the executive branch and therefore promotes accountability, is a false promise. So the unitary executive as a legal doctrine is not a huge threat to the government or to the implementation of Congress's statutes, but it describes a reality and a set of principles that don't match one another. Now, that said, I should emphasize that Anya and I note that if the president, this is as opposed to the Supreme Court and the White House, with the court's blessing, wanted to ramp up their efforts to control the bureaucracy, we could get much closer to the unitary vision than some of this doctrine suggests about the power to fire being the way the president directs the executive branch. And that's precisely what the Trump administration has been doing. The notorious or so-called Schedule F, which has become Scheduled Policy Career, Schedule G in a very wonky fashion, would move about 50,000 people in policymaking roles from the civil service to become pure political appointees. So they become partisan appointments. The DOJ and its mass firings have been incredibly significant in contravening civil service protections and using presidential power to enervate the state from within. And if you look at these efforts and you add to that highly unusual actions by this president, such as reaching into the bureaucracy to fire the person in charge of the Bureau of Labor Statistics because he didn't like the job numbers, you're seeing the emergence of an approach by the president himself to the bureaucracy that I think is different in kind and is not visible in the literal language of these unitary executive precedents from the court, but could in fact be the ultimate realization of the theory. I should emphasize that you can believe in the unitary executive theory that the president should be able to control the officers of the United States, not necessarily the civil service, but his appointees, and not want to destroy the bureaucracy. But when you have those two ideas together, and the latter is supercharged by the principled and theoretical arguments made for the former, you do get much closer to the idea of presidential control over the executive branch in an almost nihilistic fashion.
Nihilism, bringing nihilism back. Sam, I'm going to come back to you, hopefully not nihilist. But you can talk about some of these cases, maybe. You mentioned the freezing of funds. We've heard about the independent agency terminations. Can you talk about the cases that will be before the court or are before the court right now?
Yeah, so I'll talk about a couple of these cases. I think perhaps we'll start with the funding freeze cases, as you mentioned, Wilfred. So, the facts on that case, or those cases rather, are a little complicated. It all started more or less on January 27th when the Office of Management and Budget issued a memo directing federal agencies to pause nearly all federal financial assistance while they reviewed whether those funds and the spending of those funds aligned with the new administration's policy priorities. The administration then claimed to withdraw the memo. The freeze, however, remained in effect, and the freeze affected billions of dollars that funded education and healthcare and public safety programs and all the rest. Of course, the Trump administration has been claiming that it's acting under the cover of law when it sought to freeze those funds, but it's really an entirely unprecedented approach. And once again, similar to the theme we've been hitting on a lot, the president is ignoring Congress. And here, ignoring Congress, I would say twice over. First, ignoring the appropriations laws that Congress duly enacted that direct the expenditure of funds. And second, ignoring the laws that Congress passed that govern the rescission of appropriated funds, which were statutes enacted when President Nixon attempted a very similar gambit to the one that President Trump was enacting upon taking office. As these are playing out, the district court has blocked the federal funding freeze. There's now appeals of those in those cases, and we're going to see oral argument in the appellate courts in the fall. Really, the only way you can make sense of the Trump administration's position here, though, is that they think that there's some inherent authority of the president to ignore those duly enacted laws by Congress, enacted under the appropriations power that is vested in Congress and the Constitution, that the president can ignore those laws and determine for himself in certain situations how money must be spent. We're seeing, I would say, a very similar dynamic play out in the cases involving the dismantling of agencies and departments and offices in the executive branch. So people may be very familiar with the case of the Department of Education because the Trump administration has made no secret of its desire to abolish the Department of Education. And they have done so at the beginning, at least, by massively reducing the workforce. And they've claimed that they can do this because they have an inherent power to act contrary to the laws that establish the Department of Education and the laws that the Department of Education is empowered to implement. Those are statutes that Congress has passed. But once again, the Trump administration is saying those don't matter here. And the Supreme Court has essentially gone along with that argument. And that's been extremely concerning. They, just a couple weeks back, were reviewing one of the cases involving the DOE at an early stage on their emergency docket, and they essentially blessed what the Trump administration was doing, allowing it to proceed with the firings of DOE employees. Justice Sotomayor wrote a blistering dissent, which I commend to all. I'll read a very short quote here because I think it really gets at the heart of what's going on. She writes in that case that the court has, quote, handed the executive the power to repeal statutes by firing all those necessary to carry them out. So she sees what's going on, that the Trump administration is continuing to take a power that Congress has, the power to repeal a law in ways that are clearly not tolerated by the Constitution. Of course, unfortunately, the Supreme Court has already tipped its hand on how it might rule in these cases. I think Jane might be well positioned if she wants to give a quick summary on the independent agencies that you alluded to as well, Wilfred.
Yeah, Jane, maybe you can talk about those. I know there was the OSC with Dellinger. There's the Wilcox case with the NLRB. There's the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Can you tell us what's going on with the heads of those independent agencies?
Sure. So I believe there are currently 9 cases involving the removal of independent agency heads working their way through the courts. And you mentioned some of them, probably Wilcox is the most prominent, the one that's gotten the most attention. But in these cases, these officers' tenures are defined by law as a term of years. And then in almost all cases, that term of years, so-and-so shall serve for a term of 5 years, but shall be removable sooner by the president for inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office. And that's a kind of that language has been used for over 100 years to establish independent agencies. And what it's trying to do is establish a balance, right? So you've got a protected term of years, a protected, 5-year or 7-year term. But if you're really failing to do your job, if you are inefficient, which, history shows means something like incompetent, just unable to do the job. If you are neglecting your duty, meaning you're just not showing up, you're not doing it in a way that really injures the agency, or if you're malfeasant in office, then it's, which means essentially doing something illegal under the color of law, like embezzlement, then the president can remove you, because at that point the actions of the officer are imperiling the mission of the agency. The President Trump has said that these terms, he's kind of running roughshod over these statutory constraints and insisting on a right to remove at will for no reason whatsoever. And he has not offered a reason for removing these officers, despite this long historical pedigree of congressional statutes that protect officers in these ways to preserve independence. And before we turn to audience questions, I just want to kind of emphasize why we value independence in these independent agencies. We want these officers to not be completely controlled by politics, right? So there's a kind of, the unitary executive theory, as my fellow panelists have alluded to, is kind of premised on this idea that accountability flows in only one direction, and that accountability of these executive officers is secured by the president's ability to fire at will, the president, who in turn is accountable to the voters every 4 years. But that's a very kind of thin vision of accountability, and not one that this country has had for most of its history, when accountability was richer in ways that Christina was just alluding to, and had to do with transparency, conforming to the rule of law, attending to process. And part of the limits on the president's ability to fire these independent officers was itself to preserve the independence from political meddling that ensured accountable, reliable, trustworthy decision-making.
Great. So we're going to go to some audience questions. We have some great ones, and I want to tee up one that kind of ties into something, Jane, you were just saying, which is, the Supreme Court, the accountability aspect, the politics part of it, that was a part of the equation, right? We want certain attributes of accountability, expertise, things like that. And the Supreme Court has recognized it to some extent, and including in a recent emergency order where it allowed a termination to go forward, but included a caveat about the Federal Reserve, saying that this has no bearing on the Federal Reserve, yada, yada, yada. So one, if anybody has any idea why they made that carve out, that would be great to know. But also, to the audience's question, what limits on the Supreme Court, or will the Supreme Court be likely to enforce in sort of policing this?
I can talk about the Fed carve out a little bit. This is of a piece with, I think Julian was speaking earlier about the kind of maximalist vision of the unitary executive theory, where if your vision of accountability is really premised on a kind of president's ability to fire everyone, then it's really hard on a theoretical level to distinguish any part of the executive branch. It's hard to defend the independence of administrative law judges, as Julian was saying. The Fed is a kind of terrific example of this. The Fed is in charge of monetary policy in this country. And the concern, I think, that many members of this court and many members of the public have, is that if the president was able to fire at will the head of the Fed, the head of the Board of Governors, Jerome Powell, then that would allow political interference to determine kind of a key aspect of a smoothly functioning economy. And so we have seen a gesture on the part of the Supreme Court to a theory as to why the Federal Reserve should be different from other independent agencies. So that even if the Supreme Court does, in fact, decide that the president can fire the heads of independent agencies at will, despite congressional statutes to the contrary, the Fed might be different. And in a sentence in the Supreme Court's order in Wilcox v. Trump, the case about the removal of the head of the NLRB, the court said that the Fed was analogous to the kind of earlier historical examples that might mean that its independence from presidential control would be constitutional despite the unconstitutionality of the independence of the other independent agencies. And I think this idea is premised on a law review article that was published by two law professors last year, Aaron Nielsen and Aditya Bamzai. And their idea is basically that the Fed is analogous to the first and second banks of the United States, which are both early American banks chartered by Congress. They were private banks, meaning that the federal government held only 20% of its shares and the president couldn't remove their directors. And yet, the argument goes, the first and second banks of the United States conducted monetary policy by managing their lending policies to alter the supply of money and credit in the economy. And so the argument that has been put forward that I think the Supreme Court is kind of alluding to is that it would be possible to separate the Fed's regulatory role from its banking activity. And that way we could protect the independence of the monetary policy conducted by the Fed, but subject its regulatory function to presidential control. But there has been already terrific scholarship on this very point by Lev Menand at Columbia and others that has pointed out that historical analogy does not actually hold up because at this point, regulation is actually pretty much the only thing that the Federal Reserve Board does. And the true analogs to the banks of the United States are today's Federal Reserve banks and national banks like JP Morgan Chase that we already consider private. So the Fed itself cannot by any stretch be characterized as a bank that is private in character.
So I'm going to go to another audience question, but as is a habit of mine, I'm going to combine it with a question of my own that I think is kind of relevant. So it seems like the unitary executive is not just increasing the power of the Supreme Court, but in so doing, the court is increasing its own power, right? We're talking about an imperial presidency, but people have also written about an imperial court. So one, I'd love to know if there's truth to that, but then two, where is Congress in all of this? Why isn't Congress doing anything to stop the expansion or sort of misallocation of power?
Well,
and maybe there's something Congress can do.
I'm happy to offer a couple of observations in response. I think that both Julian and Jane have made this point already, which is one of the ways in which the court is actually advancing its own interests and expanding its power is by depriving Congress of its ability to structure the executive branch by eliminating a number of for-cause protections for different officials, where Congress has made the judgment that those officials should be independent from direct presidential or partisan control. The other way in which this court has really, supposedly in the service of preserving Congress's power, expanded its own power, is what it has done in the administrative law world, which we haven't really talked about directly yet. It has, for example, supercharged the so-called major questions doctrine, which says that administrative agencies, if they are addressing questions of major economic, political, or social significance, have to find express authorization in their statutes. And if they don't, then what they've done exceeds the power given to them by Congress. So the court purports to be defending Congress's prerogatives by interpreting statutes to require statutes to have this clear statement rule when agencies do major things. But what it's actually doing is giving itself and other courts the power to say what counts as a major question. And it's stopping administrative agencies from using old statutes to address new problems and to do the work that Congress tasked those agencies with doing over time. There are other examples of this. Also, the end of so-called Chevron deference, where the court has declared that it's not appropriate for courts to defer to the way that agencies interpret statutes, is motivated by the view that Courts have special expertise to interpret statutes. Agencies have no such expertise. And so it's courts who should determine by their own lights what statutes require. This is displacing the agencies and arguably also displacing Congress. And this relates back to what I said at the outset, that a lot of what's happening jurisprudentially is also in service of an anti-regulatory agenda. What explains Congress not intervening here? I think there's one pretty clear answer to that question, and that is party loyalty and President Trump's ability to have captured the entirety of the Republican Party. Congress is controlled by Republicans, and Congress is not interested in pushing back on a president that's taking away its power that the Supreme Court is enabling to happen. And with unified control of the government, there's very little that the system can ultimately do, especially if the Supreme Court is staying all of the injunctions that lower courts are issuing because the president is exceeding the boundaries of his authority under many existing statutes. So until we get a change in the balance of power, or the people express through elections that they want something different, this struggle is going to continue.
So another audience member asks about crises. And so I'd like to ask that to you. The president has used the word crisis to, justify a lot of what he's done. What are these crises, and is a strong executive necessary in a crisis situation? Julian, I think you're speaking, but you have to unmute yourself.
Is that working now?
There you go.
So I'll talk to that from a historical perspective, because I think this is one of the most important questions. And I want to emphasize it's a very, very old one. A strong, forceful, thoughtful, vigorous executive is necessary in a crisis, and has been understood to be necessary in a crisis for, well, more than centuries, for as long as anybody's been talking about government. The issue is, how do you think about structuring a government that creates the circumstances where the executive can be forceful, powerful, empowered to act in ways that respond to urgent moments, but also bound by mechanisms, by the laws, by supervision processes, enmeshed in a political process that leaves him doing something other than anything that he or she wants to. This goes back, one of my favorite quotes from one of the very early parliamentarians in the really historically important for the revolutionaries, tussles with Charles and James in England. He emphasizes that it's not, he says, not so easy to figure out how to create a solution for tyranny. And he points to exactly the dilemma that people like this excellent questioner are gesturing towards when they ask about what about powerful presidents in emergencies. He says, we cannot restrain princes too far, or we will disable them from some good, as well as inhibit them from some evil. And he goes on to really emphasize the point. To be disabled from doing good in some things may be as mischievous as to be enabled for all evils. So this balance between needing a powerful president, needing a powerful executive for the vicissitudes of governing a country, but needing a powerful president that exists within the context of checking, balancing, a separation of powers, is literally older than the Republic. And what I want to emphasize from a historical perspective is that the solution that our constitutional structure adopts for exactly this kind of question about whether and how the president should be authorized to act in emergencies is to leave it to the legislative process to extend those authorizations and then return and revise them as experience suggests. So the major change, perhaps the major structural change that is urged upon and eventually adopted by the drafting convention for the US Constitution, and much debated during ratification, is the need to strengthen the executive branch. So again, to be clear from a historical perspective, nothing, I don't think, that anybody on this panel has said to express some normative or historical reservations about the unitary executive, about the monarchical executive, is at odds with the proposition that the American president is and was understood to be an enormously empowered actor, but an actor that was the instrument of the laws, which creates the possibility for practicality as opposed to theory, innovation and development as opposed to stasis frozen at a particular moment in time. As Jane said earlier, the idea of tailoring, evolution, change. Our president today has enormously broad emergency authorities across a wide range of subject matters. A lot of what Trump is doing is legal. What I hear us talking about today on the panel is the additional pretense that in addition to participating with the most powerful legislative voice in the form of his veto and his agenda setting power in the process of creating those laws, he should also be able to take actions that are at odds with the laws that are empowering him in the first place. And that's just historically completely incorrect.
Thanks, Julian. Well, we have about 5 minutes left, so I just want to ask a final question maybe everybody on the panel can answer. And that question is, what's the one thing you would like the audience to take away from this conversation this afternoon? And I'll start with you, Jane.
Yeah, so I think the risk of a conversation like this is it can be demoralizing and depressing and disempowering. And I do not think that is the message that people should take away from this conversation. I am a historian, so I think history is an incredibly vital tool with which to critique current events. I think we should all be vocal in resistance to what the administration and in many instances the court are doing to advance this kind of this vision, this ahistorical vision of the imperial presidency. We should remember that the idea that no one is above the law, not even the president, is foundational to what it means to be a constitutional republic. We need to remember and talk about why agency independence matters. We don't want politics to determine the work of these government agencies that oversee our elections and investigate government corruption and protect consumer safety and regulate our economy and our airwaves and make myriad other decisions shaping our daily lives. And the more we can talk about these things to our neighbors, to our friends, the better off we are. We should get involved in politics, not only at the national level, but also local and state level, where there are often opportunities to kind of present and act upon a more grounded vision of executive power, and you know, in some instances to push back on what the federal government is doing. I also think we should think long term. Paul Starr just had actually what I found to be a really helpful article in the American Prospect, kind of planning for a post-Trump world and how to kind of recreate what has been upended over the past 6 months, 7 months. And he talks about legislative reforms, kind of emphasizing limits on the president's ability to impound funds or to declare an emergency. He talks about kind of Supreme Court reform. He talks about constitutional amendments to kind of establish once and for all the independence of independent agencies and to kind of limit the president's pardon power and to make clear that the president can be criminally prosecuted for bribery, for instance. So I think it's important both to kind of think short term and be vocal, but also think long term.
Julian, Christina, and Sam, in a few minutes, could you in that order?
Sure. I'll just speak briefly or try to very biggest picture commitments. There's no question that we as a country need a powerful president. That was true in the 1780s and 1790s as it is today. So our Constitution creates a powerful president, but the structure of the Constitution creates a powerful president under law, pursuant to the laws passed by Congress, with both the powers that they grant and the restrictions that go along with those powers, the sweet and also the bitter. Coming back to the wonderful, I think sort of iconic observation from Tom Paine, the law is our king. I have to obey the law. You have to obey the law. And the president has to obey the law.
I'll end by saying why I think that we should care about the assault on the bureaucracy that's being abetted by unitary executive theory, both jurisprudentially and politically, whether you think the unitary theory requires it. It matters for two really important reasons, and it's something that we should both counter and then seek to rebuild. First is that what's at stake is the idea of independent, nonpartisan decision-making based on fact and not political advantage. And I fear that the country is in danger of reverting to a corrupt spoils system. This reduces our ability to trust the government and expect fair and effective outcomes from our government. Secondly, destroying the bureaucracy or enervating it, weakening it substantially, makes us less healthy and safe and prosperous, because government loses its capacity by losing its personnel to ensure smooth administration of Social Security, healthcare, disaster warnings and relief, food, drug and device safety, clean air, safe products, public health. All of these things that we, I think, have long taken for granted are in fact at grave risk because of the view not only that the president must control the executive branch all the way down, but that the president has untrammeled authority to remake it by his own lights, which at this present moment is being remade through its destruction.
Thanks, all. And so I'll just finish by saying, echoing others, that nothing about the current state of the imperial presidency was inevitable, even if it sometimes does feel that way. This was a 4-decade project undertaken by presidents and their lawyers, by scholars and activists, by judges, and by several Supreme Court justices. And it was a 4-decade project, and is now longer than that, to take power away from Congress, as we're saying, and reallocate it to the president. But just as this version of the presidency was created only recently, I think we too can work to create something new, as Jane was alluding to, a version that is bounded by law and democratically responsive. And we have ample resources from history and from prior practice to draw upon in that effort.
Well, thank you, Jane, Julian, Christina, and Sam. It's been a great conversation, and thank you to the audience for all of your questions. I wish we had time to get them all, but time is done. But the Brennan Center looks forward to you joining in future events. You can be the first to know about the events that are going to be announced by looking to the Brennan Center's websites or signing up for the Brennan Center's newsletter at brennancenter.org/events. Thank you again. My name is Wilfred Codrington. I'm a professor at Cardozo School of Law, and I look forward to seeing you soon.